cops handcuffed a black tomb guard. Then a 4-star general entered the courtroom to apologize. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The harsh fluorescent lights of the holding cell flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the grimy walls. Sergeant Elijah Hayes sat ramrod straight on the narrow metal bench, his hands cuffed behind his back, the cold steel biting into his wrists. His uniform, the immaculate dress blues of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, was now rumpled and stained, a stark contrast to the pristine condition he maintained it in for his sacred duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Just hours ago, he had been the epitome of discipline and honor, a silent sentinel guarding the nation's most revered shrine. Now, he was just another black man in a holding cell, accused of resisting arrest and assaulting an officer, charges so ludicrous they would have been laughable if the situation weren't so grim. The altercation had been swift, brutal, and utterly unprovoked. He had been on his way to visit his ailing grandmother, taking a shortcut through a neighborhood that officers Miller and Davis apparently considered their personal fiefdom. They'd pulled him over, their questions aggressive, their demeanor laced with a casual contempt that Elijah had unfortunately grown accustomed to in his civilian life, though never expected while in the uniform he wore with such profound pride. When he had calmly tried to explain who he was, where he was going, even presenting his military identification, their aggression had escalated. A tomb guard, huh? Officer Miller had sneered, his eyes cold and dismissive. Think that makes you special, boy? Around here, you're just another mouthy troublemaker. The situation had devolved quickly. A perceived disrespectful tone, a sudden shove from Officer Davis, Elijah's instinctual, disciplined attempt to maintain his balance misinterpreted as aggression, and then he was on the ground, a knee in his back, the rough scrape of handcuffs, the taste of asphalt, and blood in his mouth. He hadn't resisted. He wouldn't. His training, his very being, was about control, about discipline. But in their eyes, his composure was defiance, his silence insolence. Now, sitting in the stale, oppressive air of the precinct, the echoing shouts and clang of cell doors a jarring cacophony compared to the solemn silence of his post. Elijah fought to maintain his composure. His grandmother would be worried. He was supposed to bring her medication. More than that, he was supposed to be back at Arlington for his next rotation, his sacred vigil. The thought of failing that duty, of his brothers in arms having to cover his absence because of this injustice, was a heavier weight than the handcuffs. Who were these officers? And why had a simple walk to his grandmother's house turned into this nightmare, threatening to tarnish not just his reputation, but the honor of the uniform he wore? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Do you believe that the uniform should command respect, regardless of the skin color of the person wearing it? Or is prejudice a stain that even the most honored symbols cannot wash away? The booking process had been a blur of deliberate humiliations. Officer Miller seemed to take a perverse pleasure in every degrading step. Elijah's meticulously shined shoes were scuffed, his perfectly creased trousers wrinkled beyond recognition as he was forced into uncomfortable positions for searching. His questions about contacting a lawyer or his commanding officer were met with smirks and vague promises of later. You'll get your call. When we say you get your call, hero, Officer Davis had grunted, shoving him towards the fingerprinting station. The ink stained his fingers that were usually immaculate, practiced in the precise, solemn movements of guarding the tomb. He felt a profound sense of defilement, not just of his person, but of the sacred trust he embodied. He was photographed, a harsh flash illuminating the exhaustion and quiet fury in his eyes, his image captured not as a sentinel of honor, but as a common criminal. His personal effects were inventoried with a sneering commentary from Miller. Nice watch, tomb guard. Bet this cost more than you make in a month. Where'd you really get it? Every word was a barb, designed to provoke, to break him. But Elijah held onto his discipline. The iron will forge through years of rigorous training and unwavering dedication. He responded to their questions with curt, respectful answers, betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. He knew that any sign of anger, Any hint of resistance would only be twisted and used against him. He was acutely aware of the power dynamic, the vulnerability of his position. He was a black man in a predominantly white police station, accused of assaulting an officer. The odds were stacked against him. He thought of his grandmother, her frail health, her unwavering faith in him. She had been so proud when he was selected for the old guard for the tomb. She'd framed the official photograph of him in his dress blues, placing it on her mantelpiece like a holy icon. The thought of her hearing about this, of the shame and worry it would cause her, was a sharper pain than any physical discomfort. He also thought of his brothers, the Sentinels. They were a small, elite unit, bound by an unspoken code of perfection and mutual reliance. His absence would be noted, his position needing to be filled. The intricate 24-hour cycle of guarding the tomb was a sacred rhythm, and he had been forcibly removed from it. The dishonor stung more than the handcuffs. What had he done to deserve this? He had dedicated his life to service, to embodying the highest ideals of duty and respect. He had stood vigil in scorching heat and freezing cold, his focus absolute, his commitment unwavering, honoring the nameless fallen who represented the ultimate sacrifice. And for what? To be treated like this, by men who wore a different uniform, men who had sworn a similar oath to protect and serve, yet seemed to embody the very opposite. As he was finally led to the holding cell, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind him with a sound of grim finality, Elijah allowed himself a single, deep, shuddering breath. He would not break. He would not give them the satisfaction. He was a sentinel of the tomb of the unknown soldier. He represented something far greater than himself, something that transcended this ugly, unjust moment. He would hold on to that, cling to it like a lifeline in a raging storm. But as the hours wore on, the silence of the cell, broken only by the distant sounds of the precinct, a cold dread began to seep into his resolve. How would he fight this? Who would believe him over the word of two police officers? The system, he knew, was often designed to protect its own. The injustice was not just personal. It felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever believed in, everything he had ever stood for. He was a guardian of honor, now stripped of his own. The irony was a bitter, corrosive acid in his soul. Elijah Hayes had not been born into a life of privilege or expectation. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in Anacostia, raised by a grandmother who instilled in him the values of discipline, respect, and unwavering integrity. His grandfather had served in the segregated army during World War II, a fact that was spoken of with a mixture of pride and quiet sorrow in their household. Young Elijah listened to his grandmother's stories of courage in the face of adversity, of dignity maintained even when denied by the world. He learned early that true honor was not about external validation, but about an internal compass, a commitment to doing what was right, regardless of the cost. From a young age, he was drawn to the military, not for glory or adventure, but for the structure, the purpose, the ideal of service to something larger than oneself. He excelled in school, was a quiet leader among his peers, always carrying himself with a seriousness that belied his years. When he enlisted in the army, he found his calling. He thrived under the rigorous discipline, the demanding standards. He was a natural soldier, quick to learn, steady under pressure, respected by his superiors and his fellow recruits alike. His path to the old guard, and ultimately to the tomb of the unknown soldier, was neither easy nor accidental. It was the culmination of years of flawless service, perfect conduct, and an almost fanatical attention to detail. The Sentinels of the tomb are handpicked, rigorously vetted, and subjected to training that pushes them to the very limits of human endurance, both physically and mentally. Every step, every movement, every crease in their uniform, every gleam on their rifle must be perfect. They are the living embodiment of the nation's solemn promise to never forget its fallen. For Elijah, being selected as a tomb guard was the highest honor he could imagine. It was not a job. It was a sacred trust, a profound responsibility. He memorized the creed. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and without reservation. I will guard this hallowed ground, regardless of the weather, the danger, or the personal cost. He lived those words. He understood the symbolism of his silent vigil, the 21 steps, the 21-second pause, the precise turn, the unwavering gaze. He was guarding not just the remains of unknown soldiers, but the very idea of selfless sacrifice, of anonymous heroism. He knew that people from all over the world came to Arlington to witness that solemn ritual, to find solace, to pay their respects. And he, Sergeant Elijah Hayes, was a part of that, a humble instrument in a profound national ceremony. He had sacrificed much for this duty. His personal life was severely curtailed. The demands of the training and the vigil were all-consuming. Relationships were difficult to maintain, but he had accepted these costs willingly, believing in the importance of his mission. He remembered the first time he had walked the mat, the weight of history, of expectation settling upon his shoulders. He remembered the profound silence of the crowd, the click of his heels the only sound, a metronome marking the solemn rhythm of remembrance. He had felt a connection to the unknowns, a sense of kinship with those who had given everything, their names lost to history, but their sacrifice eternally honored. This duty had shaped him, refined him, imbued him with a quiet strength, a profound sense of purpose. It was this man, this dedicated soldier, this guardian of sacred honor, who now sat in a cold, dirty holding cell, accused of common thuggery. The contrast was a chasm, a betrayal so deep it was almost impossible to comprehend. He thought of his grandmother's proud face when she had attended the ceremony marking his official assignment to the tomb. She had cried, tears of joy and pride, telling him his grandfather would have been so proud. How could he tell her about this? How could he explain this degradation, this injustice, to a woman who had taught him to believe in the inherent goodness of service, in the promise of a nation that, for all its flaws, strived for better? The system he had sworn to uphold, the system he represented in its most pristine form, had now turned on him, had judged him not by the content of his character or the honor of his service, but by the color of his skin and the arrogance of two misguided officers. The pain of that betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever endured. Yet, even in the depths of this despair, the core of his training, the essence of his being a sentinel, held firm. Discipline, control, endure. He would face this, as he had faced every challenge in his life, with unwavering resolve. He was a guardian, and even here, in this place of dishonor, he would guard his own integrity, his own truth. The promised phone call finally came hours later, a brief, monitored conversation. Elijah called his grandmother first, his voice carefully controlled, trying not to alarm her. "Grandma, it's Elijah. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm going to be delayed." He could hear the worry in her voice, her questions, but he couldn't tell her the truth, not like this. He assured her he was safe, that he would explain everything soon. He then called his unit liaison at Arlington, Sergeant Major Peterson, a man known for his stern demeanor but underlying fairness. The sergeant major listened in stunned silence as Elijah briefly, factually recounted the events. Arrested? Resisting? Assaulting an officer? "Hayes, are you telling me the truth?" Peterson's voice was incredulous. "Yes, Sergeant Major. Every word." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This is highly irregular, Hayes. Tomb guards are not known for brawling with local police. There must be more to this. I'll make some calls. Sit tight. And Hayes, maintain your bearing." The last words were a command, but also an affirmation of trust. Maintain your bearing. It was the Sentinel's code. The legal process, when it began, was a disheartening crawl. A harried public defender, juggling dozens of cases, met with Elijah for all of 10 minutes. He listened with a jaded air, seeming to accept the police report at face value. "Look, Sergeant Hayes," the public defender said, flipping through the file. "Two officers say you resisted. You say you didn't. It's their word against yours. Best we can probably do is plead down to disorderly conduct, get you time served and probation." Elijah was aghast. "Plead guilty? To something I didn't do? That will go on my record. It could affect my service, my duty at the tomb." The public defender shrugged. "That's the system, Sergeant. It's not always fair. It's about what they can prove or what a jury will believe. And juries tend to believe cops." His initial court appearance was a brief, humiliating affair. He stood before a judge who seemed more interested in clearing his docket than in dispensing justice. The prosecutor read the charges, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Bail was set at an exorbitant amount, far beyond Elijah's means. He was remanded back to custody, the gears of the system grinding him down, an anonymous cog in a vast, indifferent machine. He saw no friendly faces in the courtroom, no one from his unit. Sergeant Major Peterson's promise to make some calls felt like a distant, fading hope. Days bled into a week. The conditions in the county jail were deplorable. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, the constant threat of violence. Elijah kept to himself, his military discipline his only shield. He endured the taunts, the threats, the soul-crushing boredom, focusing on maintaining his physical and mental readiness, just as he had been trained to do. He performed meticulous mental rehearsals of his guarding duties at the tomb. Each step, each turn, each silent count, a way of holding onto his identity, his purpose, in a place designed to strip it all away. He saw other men, mostly black and brown, caught in the same indifferent system, their lives derailed by minor offenses, by biased policing, by a lack of resources to fight back. He saw the casual cruelty of some of the correctional officers, the weary resignation of others. It was a world away from the solemn dignity of Arlington, a stark testament to the deep fissures in the nation he had sworn to serve. One evening, a younger correctional officer, a man named Ramirez who had always treated Elijah with a modicum of respect, slipped him an extra blanket during cell check. "Heard you were one of them tomb guards," Ramirez said quietly, his eyes darting around to make sure they weren't overheard. "My uncle served in the 82nd. Got a lot of respect for you fellas. This whole thing, it don't seem right." It was a small gesture, a fleeting moment of human connection in a dehumanizing environment, but it meant the world to Elijah. It was a reminder that not everyone was blind, not everyone was indifferent. Hope, he realized, could be found in the most unexpected of places. But hope was a fragile commodity in the county jail. His next court date was approaching, and the public defender was still pushing him to accept a plea deal. The thought of a criminal record, of being dishonorably discharged from the duty that was his life's calling, was a constant torment. He felt trapped, abandoned, the very system he believed in, the system he represented with such unwavering honor, now poised to condemn him unjustly. The weight of it was immense, a crushing burden that threatened to extinguish the quiet fire of his resolve. The news of Sergeant Elijah Hayes' arrest and incarceration did not stay contained within the drab walls of the county jail or the indifferent halls of the municipal court. Sergeant Major Peterson, true to his word, had indeed made some calls. And those calls, like ripples in a pond, began to spread, reaching ears that were not accustomed to ignoring injustices against one of their own, especially ones serving in such a revered and visible capacity as a sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The Old Guard, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, is more than just a ceremonial unit. It is a brotherhood, steeped in history and tradition, with a fierce pride in its soldiers and their impeccable standards. The idea that one of their tomb guards, a soldier meticulously selected for his flawless character and discipline, could be involved in a common street brawl and assault on police officers was almost inconceivable. Disbelief quickly turned to a quiet, simmering anger among Elijah's comrades at Arlington. They knew him. They knew his unwavering integrity, his almost superhuman self-control. The official police report, when it was discreetly obtained, read like a caricature of a resisting arrest scenario, full of subjective interpretations and convenient omissions. Suspicions grew. Meanwhile, Elijah's grandmother, distraught but resolute, had contacted her local church. The pastor, a man with strong ties to community activists and civil rights organizations, began to make inquiries. A small article appeared in a local community newspaper, then was picked up by a veterans advocacy blog, tentatively headlined, "Tomb Guard Arrested Under Questionable Circumstances." The story began to gain traction, fueled by the inherent incredulity of the situation. A sentinel from the Tomb of the Unknowns, a symbol of national honor and sacrifice, in jail for assaulting police? It didn't add up. Within the police department that had arrested Elijah, officers Miller and Davis were feeling quite pleased with themselves. They had, in their view, put a disrespectful subject in his place, and their report, backed by their brother officers, was unassailable. They joked about it in the locker room, embellishing the details, painting Elijah as an aggressive, entitled individual who had gotten what he deserved. Their precinct captain, a man cut from the same cloth, had signed off on their report without a second glance. Any internal rumblings of concern were quickly squashed by the blue wall of silence. However, Officer Ramirez, the correctional officer who had shown Elijah a small kindness, was troubled. He had seen Elijah's quiet dignity, his discipline, even in the squalor of the jail. He had also overheard Miller and Davis boasting in the precinct cafeteria before his shift, their version of events sounding far more like an abuse of power than a legitimate arrest. Ramirez, a young officer with only a few years on the force, was wrestling with his conscience. Reporting fellow officers was a dangerous path, one that could lead to ostracization, retaliation, or even the end of his career. Yet, the injustice of Elijah's situation gnawed at him. He discreetly looked up the public records of Elijah's arrest. The details were sparse, but the charges resisting arrest, assault on an officer, seemed wildly out of character for a soldier of Elijah's apparent caliber. He then made an anonymous call to a veterans helpline, providing the case number and expressing his concerns about the circumstances of the arrest. This small act, born of a troubled conscience, added another piece to the growing puzzle. The information eventually found its way to a retired Army colonel, Marcus Thorne, no relation to Elias from a previous story, but a man of similar integrity, who now worked with a prominent national veterans' rights organization. Colonel Thorne had served with the Old Guard early in his career and understood the caliber of men selected for tomb duty. He immediately recognized the red flags in Elijah's case. He knew that if a tomb guard was in trouble, it was almost certainly because trouble had found him, not the other way around. Colonel Thorne began his own investigation, leveraging his extensive network of contacts within the military, the legal profession, and even some reform-minded factions within law enforcement. He pulled Elijah's service record, flawless, exemplary, filled with commendations for discipline and professionalism. He spoke to Sergeant Major Peterson, who vouched unequivocally for Elijah's character. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture not of a rogue soldier, but of a victim of a flawed and potentially corrupt system. The focus began to shift from Elijah's alleged crime to the conduct of the arresting officers, Miller and Davis. Colonel Thorne's organization discreetly began searching for past complaints, for patterns of behavior. It was a slow, meticulous process, but the resolve was hardening. The honor of a tomb guard was at stake, and by extension, the honor of all who served. The story, still mostly under the radar of the mainstream media, was nonetheless building momentum within the circles that mattered: military communities, veterans groups, civil rights organizations. The quiet injustice faced by Sergeant Elijah Hayes was about to become a much louder, much more public concern. The efforts of Sergeant Major Peterson, Colonel Thorne, and the growing network of concerned individuals began to converge, creating a powerful undercurrent of inquiry that was slowly but surely making its way up the chain of command, both military and civilian. While Elijah Hayes endured another day in the stark reality of the county jail, unaware of the forces now mobilizing on his behalf, wheels were turning in places of significant influence. Colonel Thorne's veterans organization, armed with Elijah's impeccable service record and troubling preliminary findings about officers Miller and Davis, escalated the matter. They prepared a formal complaint to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, alleging a pattern of biased policing and abuse of authority by the specific precinct involved in Elijah's arrest. They also began to quietly brief influential members of Congress who served on armed services committees or were known advocates for veterans' rights. The name Sergeant Elijah Hayes, sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier, began to appear on memos and in hushed conversations in Washington, D.C. Within the military itself, the Chief of Staff of the Army's office was made aware of the situation. While direct military intervention in a civilian legal matter was complex and fraught with protocol, the arrest and continued detention of an active duty soldier from such a high-profile, symbolic unit as the Old Guard, under such questionable circumstances, was a matter of grave concern. The dignity of the uniform, the reputation of the Army, and the morale of its soldiers were all implicated. Discreet inquiries were made from the Pentagon to the city's mayor and the chief of police. These were not yet demands, but expressions of significant interest and requests for clarification, diplomatic language that nonetheless carried considerable weight. The city's chief of police, a man named Henderson who was more of a political appointee than a seasoned law enforcement leader, initially tried to dismiss the inquiries. He backed his officers, Miller and Davis, citing their official report and portraying Elijah Hayes as an uncooperative and aggressive individual. He was, however, unprepared for the level of scrutiny that was about to descend. The intervention that would truly shift the paradigm came from an even higher echelon. General Alastair Thompson, a four-star general renowned for his battlefield leadership, his unwavering integrity, and his fierce advocacy for his soldiers, was a man who had never forgotten his own roots as a young enlisted man. He had a particular reverence for the traditions and the soldiers of the Old Guard, having served as its commander earlier in his career, when his longtime aide, a highly respected command sergeant major who maintained close ties with units like the Sentinels, brought Elijah Hayes' case to his personal attention. General Thompson listened with a thunderous silence. The details, the unprovoked stop, the disrespectful treatment of a tomb guard in uniform. Even if off-duty, his demeanor and likely initial statements would reflect his service. The trumped-up charges, the exorbitant bail, the indifferent legal representation, painted a picture that deeply offended the general's core values. A sentinel from the tomb, General Thompson had said, his voice dangerously quiet, treated like common refuse by local constabulary. His honor, his service, the very symbolism of his duty, spat upon? This will not stand. General Thompson was not a man for half measures. He understood optics, but he understood justice even more. He knew he couldn't directly interfere with a civilian court case, but he also knew the immense moral authority his rank and reputation carried. He initiated his own discreet, high-level investigation. He had his staff pull every piece of information available on Sergeant Hayes, every performance review, every commendation, every personal detail. The portrait that emerged was of an exemplary soldier, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering commitment, the very embodiment of the ideals the tomb sentinels represented. He also had his intelligence network discreetly gather information on officers Miller and Davis and their precinct. A pattern of excessive force complaints, racial profiling allegations, and conveniently lost evidence began to emerge, a pattern that Chief Henderson had either ignored or actively suppressed. The general began to formulate a plan. It would be unconventional, perhaps even controversial, but he was determined to see that justice was done and that Sergeant Hayes' honor was restored. He wouldn't allow a good soldier, a symbol of the nation's solemn trust, to be crushed by a corrupt or indifferent system. The weight of a four-star general's focused attention is a formidable thing. Chief Henderson, officers Miller and Davis, and the complacent municipal court system of their city were about to experience its full, unyielding pressure. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would go far beyond a simple courtroom hearing. It was becoming a battle for the soul of justice and for the respect owed to those who serve. General Alastair Thompson's approach was multi-pronged, executed with the strategic precision of a seasoned commander. He understood that a direct, public confrontation with the civilian authorities in Elijah Hayes' case could backfire, potentially being portrayed as military overreach. Instead, He opted for a more nuanced, but no less powerful, strategy designed to bring overwhelming moral and institutional pressure to bear. First, he personally contacted the Secretary of the Army, briefing him on the situation and securing his tacit support for ensuring a soldier's rights are fully protected and his honorable service is appropriately recognized. This provided top-level cover and signaled that the Army was taking the matter seriously. Next, General Thompson reached out to several influential retired four-star generals, men whose opinions carried immense weight in Washington and in the media. He shared the details of Sergeant Hayes's case, emphasizing the disrespect shown not just to an individual soldier, but to the sacred duty of the Tomb Guard. These retired generals, outraged, began making their own discreet calls to contacts in Congress, the Department of Justice, and national news organizations. The story, previously a niche concern, started to gain wider, more prominent attention. Editorials began to appear, questioning the treatment of military personnel by civilian authorities and highlighting the impeccable record of tomb sentinels. Simultaneously, General Thompson instructed his legal staff to liaise with Colonel Thorne's Veterans Rights Organization, offering military legal resources to assist in Sergeant Hayes's defense. A top military defense attorney, renowned for his tenacity and courtroom prowess, was quietly dispatched to consult with Elijah's public defender, effectively upgrading his legal representation overnight. The public defender, initially dismissive, found himself sitting across from a lieutenant colonel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, who politely but firmly made it clear that Sergeant Hayes's case was now a matter of significant military interest and that a vigorous defense, challenging every aspect of the prosecution's narrative, was expected. The general also activated his personal network within the special operations community, men who understood the meaning of brotherhood and loyalty. He didn't ask for anything illegal or untoward, but he shared his profound disappointment and anger over Sergeant Hayes's treatment. He knew that these men, with their own extensive networks, would find ways to make their displeasure known in circles that officers Miller and Davis might frequent, creating a different kind of pressure, a social and professional chill that even the blue wall couldn't entirely deflect. The most visible part of General Thompson's strategy, however, was still to come. He planned to attend Sergeant Hayes's next court hearing, not in civilian clothes, not as a discreet observer, but in his full Class A uniform, adorned with the 4 stars of his rank and the myriad ribbons and medals that testified to a lifetime of distinguished service. He would not speak out of turn, would not disrupt the proceedings, but his silent, uniformed presence in that small municipal courtroom would be a statement more powerful than any shouted demand. He knew the impact it would have on the judge, on the prosecutor, on the observing media, and, most importantly, on Sergeant Hayes himself, who had been made to feel abandoned and alone. Word of the general's intended attendance began to leak out, as he knew it would. Chief Henderson received a panic call from the mayor's office. The prospect of a 4-star general, a national military figure, sitting in their municipal court for the arraignment of a soldier on charges of assaulting his officers, was a public relations nightmare they had not anticipated. Suddenly, Chief Henderson was very interested in reviewing the details of Sergeant Hayes's arrest. Officers Miller and Davis were summoned to his office, no longer for commendation, but for a grilling. Their smug confidence began to crack under the unexpected pressure from their own chief, who was now desperate to mitigate the impending disaster. They stuck to their story, but their denials sounded hollower, their bravado forced. The atmosphere in their precinct shifted. Fellow officers, who had previously offered tacit support or amused indifference, now looked at Miller and Davis with a mixture of apprehension and resentment. They had brought a firestorm down on the department. Elijah Hayes, still incarcerated, knew nothing of these high-level maneuvers. He only knew that his new military legal consultant was asking very pointed questions, that his public defender seemed suddenly more engaged, and that there was a new, almost respectful caution in the way some of the correctional officers treated him. Officer Ramirez even managed to whisper to him, "Hang in there, Sergeant. I think some big wheels are turning for you." It was a sliver of hope, but Elijah, tempered by his ordeal, remained wary. He had seen how quickly hope could be extinguished by the grinding indifference of the system. He prepared himself for his next court appearance with the stoic discipline of a soldier facing an uncertain battle, unaware that an entirely unexpected and incredibly powerful form of cavalry was on its way. The morning of Sergeant Elijah Hayes's bail review hearing dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the mood of uncertainty that hung over the municipal courthouse. Inside, the usual chaotic hum was amplified by an undercurrent of nervous anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. General Alastair Thompson, a bona fide four-star military legend, was expected to attend. Court staff whispered, lawyers adjusted their ties with extra care, and even Judge Harrison, a man known for his irascible demeanor and impatience with perceived trifles, seemed unusually subdued as he took the bench. Officers Miller and Davis were present, seated near the prosecutor's table. Their earlier arrogance had been replaced by a sullen, defensive posture. They had been grilled by internal affairs, questioned by their increasingly agitated chief, and were now facing the uncomfortable prospect of having their actions scrutinized under a national spotlight. They exchanged nervous glances, the blue wall that had always protected them suddenly feeling porous and unreliable. Elijah Hayes was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, his borrowed jail jumpsuit a stark contrast to the image of him in his immaculate Tomb Guard uniform that was now beginning to circulate in news reports. He looked tired, the strain of his unjust incarceration etched on his face, but his back was straight, his gaze steady. He scanned the public gallery, perhaps looking for a familiar face, a sign of support. He saw his grandmother, looking frail but resolute, seated next to a stern-faced Colonel Thorne. And then, the courtroom doors at the back opened, and a hush fell over the entire room. General Alastair Thompson entered, in his full dress uniform, the 4 silver stars on his shoulders gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He moved with an unhurried, commanding presence, his aide, a young captain, a respectful step behind him. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him. The air crackled with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and palpable tension. Judge Harrison visibly straightened in his chair. The prosecutor fumbled with his notes. Miller and Davis seemed to shrink in their seats. General Thompson didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a thunderous statement. He walked slowly, deliberately down the center aisle, his gaze sweeping across the room, acknowledging no one in particular, yet seeing everything. He chose a seat in the front row of the public gallery, directly behind Sergeant Hayes, a silent, powerful symbol of support and scrutiny. The judge, after a moment of flustered silence, cleared his throat and called Sergeant Hayes's case. Case number 729, B, City versus Elijah Hayes. Charges: resisting arrest, assault on a law enforcement officer. Counsel, are we ready to proceed with the bail review? Elijah's public defender, now flanked by the formidable lieutenant colonel from the JAG Corps, stood. Your Honor, the lieutenant colonel began, his voice calm but authoritative. We are ready, and we contend that the bail currently set is excessive and unwarranted, given Sergeant Hayes's exemplary service record, his deep ties to this community through his family, and the highly questionable circumstances of his arrest. He then proceeded, with meticulous precision, to dismantle the prosecution's narrative. He presented Elijah's flawless military record, letters of commendation from his commanding officers in the Old Guard, and even a sworn affidavit from Sergeant Major Peterson attesting to his impeccable character and discipline. He highlighted inconsistencies in the police report filed by officers Miller and Davis, and subtly alluded to a pattern of similar complaints against them that were now under active review by other agencies. Throughout this presentation, General Thompson sat motionless, his gaze fixed on Judge Harrison. The judge, usually so quick to interrupt and dismiss, listened with uncharacteristic attentiveness, acutely aware of the 4-star elephant in his courtroom. When the lieutenant colonel finished, the prosecutor, a young, ambitious man who had likely seen this as a straightforward case just days before, rose uncertainly. He attempted to reiterate the severity of the charges, the alleged threat Elijah posed, but his arguments sounded weak, almost apologetic, in the face of the evidence of Elijah's character and the silent, powerful judgment emanating from the front row. He knew he was being outmaneuvered, not just legally, but morally. The power dynamic in the courtroom had irrevocably shifted. The focus was no longer on the alleged transgressions of Sergeant Hayes, but on the actions and integrity of the arresting officers and the system that had so readily accepted their version of events. The silent, dignified presence of General Thompson had turned a routine bail hearing into a referendum on justice itself. Judge Harrison, a man accustomed to wielding unquestioned authority in his courtroom, found himself in an uncomfortably scrutinized position. The weight of General Thompson's gaze, the presence of a high-powered military lawyer, and a now palpable public and media interest in Sergeant Hayes' case had transformed a minor municipal matter into something far more significant. He cleared his throat, shuffling papers on his bench, buying time. "The court has heard the arguments," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "and has reviewed the additional documentation provided by the defense regarding Sergeant Hayes' background and service." He glanced briefly, almost involuntarily, towards General Thompson, then quickly looked away. In light of this information, and considering the defendant's lack of any prior criminal record and his strong community ties, the court finds that the previously set bail was indeed excessive. He paused. "Bail is hereby reduced to personal recognizance. Sergeant Hayes, you are free to leave on your own recognizance pending your next court appearance." A wave of relief washed over Elijah's face, the first visible crack in his stoic composure. His grandmother let out a soft sob of gratitude. Colonel Thorne placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Officers Miller and Davis exchanged panicked looks. This was not how things were supposed to go. Their airtight case was unraveling before their eyes. As the court clerk processed the release paperwork, General Thompson rose slowly from his seat. He didn't approach the bench, nor did he address the judge directly in a way that could be construed as interference. Instead, he walked over to where Elijah Hayes was standing, his handcuffs now removed. In full view of the entire courtroom, of the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, General Thompson extended his hand to Sergeant Hayes. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but resonant, filled with respect, "it is an honor to finally meet you in person. Your nation is proud of your service and profoundly grateful for your dedication at the tomb. What you have endured these past days is an injustice that will be rectified." Elijah, momentarily speechless, gripped the general's outstretched hand. "General Thompson, sir," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you. No thanks are necessary, Sergeant," the general replied. "We look after our own, and you, son, are one of our finest." He then turned, his gaze sweeping over officers Miller and Davis, then settling on the prosecutor and finally Judge Harrison. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was more eloquent than any words. It was a look that promised accountability, a look that signaled this was far from over. He then addressed the court, his voice now carrying the full weight of his four-star authority, though still impeccably polite. "Your Honor, if I may, as a senior officer of the United States Army, and as a citizen deeply concerned with the fair administration of justice, particularly as it pertains to our nation's servicemen and women, I wish to state for the record my profound disappointment in the circumstances that brought Sergeant Hayes before this court. The treatment he received, the questions raised about the conduct of the arresting officers, and the initial failure of the system to recognize the character of this exceptional soldier are matters that I trust will be investigated thoroughly and transparently." He paused, letting his words sink in. Sergeant Hayes embodies the highest ideals of duty, honor, and country. He, and all who wear the uniform, deserve nothing less than the utmost respect and the full, impartial protection of the law. I am confident that, moving forward, justice will prevail in this matter. With that, General Thompson gave a slight, formal nod to the bench, then turned and, with Sergeant Hayes and Colonel Thorne at his side, walked slowly out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned silence, a deeply chastened judge, a visibly shaken prosecutor, and two police officers whose careers were now hanging by the thinnest of threads. The power of integrity, backed by undeniable authority, had spoken. The system had been challenged, and, for one soldier at least, it had been forced to bend towards justice. The image of General Alastair Thompson, a four-star general in full dress uniform, personally escorting Sergeant Elijah Hayes from the municipal courtroom, became an iconic one, captured by news photographers and flashed across screens nationwide. It symbolized more than just the release of one unjustly accused soldier. It represented a powerful rebuke to a flawed system and a profound affirmation of the respect due to those who serve. The immediate aftermath was swift. Chief Henderson, under immense pressure from the mayor's office, the city council, and now, undeniably from the Pentagon, immediately suspended officers Miller and Davis pending a full investigation by a newly formed internal affairs task force, one that tellingly included an observer from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, a detail likely facilitated by General Thompson's discreet influence. The charges against Sergeant Hayes were not immediately dropped. The prosecutor, seeking to save face, spoke of needing to review all available evidence, but it was clear to everyone involved that the case against him had effectively collapsed. The narrative had shifted entirely from Elijah's alleged guilt to the misconduct of the arresting officers. Elijah, overwhelmed but deeply grateful, was reunited with his tearful grandmother and his relieved comrades from the old guard. Sergeant Major Peterson was there, his stern face softened by a rare smile. "Welcome back, Hayes," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We kept your station warm. The tomb awaits its sentinel." The outpouring of support was immense. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and ordinary citizens expressed their outrage at Elijah's treatment and their admiration for his quiet dignity and General Thompson's decisive intervention. The story resonated deeply, touching on themes of racial injustice, respect for military service, and the abuse of power. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into officers Miller and Davis uncovered a pattern of complaints, particularly from minority citizens, that had been systematically ignored or dismissed by their precinct captain, who was also subsequently suspended. Officer Ramirez, the correctional officer who had shown Elijah kindness, came forward as a whistleblower, providing crucial testimony about the attitudes and behaviors prevalent in that precinct, and specifically about Miller and Davis's history of aggressive and biased policing. His courage, inspired in part by Elijah's own quiet strength, helped to expose the deeper rot within that segment of the department. General Thompson, true to his word, ensured that the thorough and transparent investigation he had called for actually materialized. He didn't interfere directly, but his continued interest in the case kept the pressure on local authorities to act decisively and fairly. He also personally ensured that Sergeant Hayes received any support he needed, both legally and personally, to recover from his ordeal. The charges against Elijah were eventually and quietly dismissed in the interest of justice. There was no apology from the prosecutor's office, but the victory was clear. Officers Miller and Davis were ultimately fired from the police force, their careers in law enforcement over. Several other officers in their precinct faced disciplinary action, and Chief Henderson, his leadership exposed as weak and ineffectual, announced his early retirement. The city, forced to confront the ugly realities of its own police department, embarked on a difficult but necessary process of reform, implementing new training programs, civilian oversight boards, and community policing initiatives, all spurred by the glaring spotlight that Sergeant Hayes' case had thrown on its systemic failings. Sergeant Elijah Hayes returned to his sacred duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier. He walked the mat with the same flawless precision, the same profound dignity as before. But something had changed. He carried himself with a new, quiet authority, a deeper understanding of the freedoms he guarded and the injustices that still threatened them. He became an unintentional symbol, a reminder that even in the most honored uniforms, prejudice can strike, but also that integrity, courage, and the unwavering support of a true brotherhood can ultimately prevail. General Thompson, in a later, private conversation with Elijah, simply said, You upheld the honor of the tomb, Sergeant, even in that jail cell. And in doing so, you reminded all of us what true service looks like. The story of Sergeant Elijah Hayes and General Alastair Thompson became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that one man's dignity, when defended by another's principled stand, can indeed move mountains, or at least shake the foundations of a complacent and unjust system. It was a reminder that the highest ranks of honor are not always found on a uniform, but in the unwavering commitment to justice and respect for all. The full impact of Sergeant Elijah Hayes' ordeal and General Thompson's intervention continued to unfold long after the courtroom drama subsided. The city of Northwood, where the arrest took place, found itself at the epicenter of a national conversation about policing, racial bias, and the treatment of veterans. The mayor, facing intense public pressure and the threat of a full-scale Department of Justice consent decree, fast-tracked a series of comprehensive police reforms. A new police chief was recruited from outside the state, an individual with a proven track record in community policing and departmental accountability, much like the protagonist in a similar story of reform. The precinct where officers Miller and Davis had operated was subjected to a top-to-bottom overhaul, with new leadership and mandatory retraining for all remaining officers. The blue wall of silence that had protected misconduct for so long began to show significant cracks, as more officers like Ramirez found the courage to speak out against corruption and abuse, knowing they now had a system that might actually listen and act. For Elijah, life eventually settled back into the solemn rhythm of his duties at Arlington. The intense media spotlight faded, and he was grateful for the return to the respectful anonymity that his role as a sentinel usually afforded. Yet he was not unchanged. The experience had deepened his already profound understanding of sacrifice and injustice. He found himself looking at the visitors to the tomb with new eyes, wondering about their own unseen battles, their own struggles for dignity and respect. He occasionally received letters from strangers, veterans, and civilians alike, expressing their gratitude for his quiet strength and for General Thompson's stand. He never sought public recognition, but he understood that his story had become a source of inspiration for many, a testament to the power of resilience in the face of adversity. He also maintained a quiet correspondence with General Thompson. The four-star general and the humble tomb guard, from vastly different ends of the military hierarchy, had formed an unlikely bond, forged in a shared commitment to honor and justice. General Thompson, in his remaining years of service and later in his retirement, often spoke of Sergeant Hayes' case in leadership seminars and discussions on military ethics, using it as a powerful example of why senior leaders must always be vigilant in protecting their soldiers and upholding the core values of their service. The changes were not just local. The national attention generated by Sergeant Hayes' case contributed to a renewed push for federal legislation aimed at improving police accountability and addressing systemic bias in the justice system. Veterans organizations used his story to advocate for better support systems for service members transitioning to civilian life and for stronger protections against discrimination. The tomb of the unknown soldier itself, already a sacred space, seemed to gain an even deeper resonance for many who knew Elijah's story. His silent, unwavering vigil became an even more potent symbol of honor, not just for the unknown fallen, but for the living soldiers who continued to serve with integrity, often in the face of challenges both seen and unseen. Elijah never spoke publicly about his ordeal. His duty was to the unknowns, to the solemn ritual of remembrance. But his presence on the mat, his flawless execution of every step, every movement, seemed to carry an added weight, an unspoken message of resilience, of dignity reclaimed, of justice, however hard won, ultimately served. He knew that the fight for a truly just and equitable society was far from over. He had seen its failings firsthand, but he had also seen its potential for redemption, its capacity for honor, embodied in men like General Thompson, and even in the small, courageous act of a young correctional officer named Ramirez. And so, Sergeant Elijah Hayes continued his watch, a silent guardian at the heart of the nation, a living testament to the enduring power of duty, honor, and the quiet courage to simply maintain one's bearing, even when the world around seeks to break it. His story, and the story of the general who stood for him, became a quiet echo in the annals of military lore, a reminder that true strength is not about the power to command, but the courage to serve and to protect those who serve with unwavering integrity.